Thank you, Shannon. In terms of funny letters on my name, I've got a PhD, but I'm also a PGP, which is a professional geophysicist. So I'm a hydrogeologist and a geophysicist. I'm not a professional geophysicist in the state of Oklahoma because we don't certify anybody in any geologic sciences. So you can't be a professional geologist, you can't be a professional hydrogeologist, nor can you be a professional geophysicist in this state. Contrary to most extension people at the university, OSU is built as an extension university. It was founded on principles of the rural folks needing to have a university to train people and provide answers to the community. And back in 1850s, 60s range, Senator Morrill proposed that these kind of universities exist. And so our job is to answer questions in one sense. I'm answering questions that have universities nervous, and I talk about it regularly. So contrary to most people that give these talks, I got my own legal disclaimer from the university that says, I'm working for the university, I know some things about this topic, I'm not providing the opinion of Oklahoma State University. If that's legal disclaiming enough. We'll go through a few different things. It's not often that people are really interested in hydrogeophysics. Oklahoma's got a little more interest than other people. So we'll talk about a few different things. We'll start with the rock and a hard place here, which is trying to talk about technology in the modern day is really pretty difficult. If you look at developing airlines and working on that through the 40s and 50s, we basically put people up in little tubes. We crashed them enough until we figured out how to do it. And nowadays, airline crashes make a lot of news because they're a pretty rare event. And people back then said, you're going to have to work this out. And there was sort of a counter argument of, and we definitely have a reason to want to work that out. In the modern day, it's somebody's the bad guy, somebody's the good guy. You got to form one of the teams. And you can't talk about technical fuzz because if the fact doesn't meet what you want to do, well, then you're obviously on the other side if you're trying to talk about data and facts. So I try to hang out in the middle. I've been accused of being pro-oil. I've been accused of being a pro-environmental. I got somebody to accuse me of being overly neutral. So you can't actually go too far in neutrality. But what I try to do is provide a perspective on the situation based on peer-reviewed data that can tell you as much as possible about it. And if you've got questions about, hey, are you guys really sure about that, or is that a little fuzzy, I try to provide the level of fuzz too. So if you see a slide that you go, that's pretty non-neutral, or if you see something that you go, you need to make sure that that fits more in the middle, let me know. I've had different people feed back that information, and so I've tried to keep it that way over the different talks. Couple old things about the oil industry. Number one, if you go and find out about a pill, you're probably finding out about a pill because there's going to be commercials all night long. And depending on what condition you have, you'll know that a lot of people have your condition if that commercial comes on during your show. At 3 in the morning, there's a lot of insomniac pills that are sold. Likewise, if a medical condition comes out on TV, they're going to bring out a person who actually had medical classes to tell you about that pill, that surgery, that thing that was done, and they've actually had some experience with it. If you have something to do with the earth, most commonly over the last decade it's been climate change issues, they'll bring out somebody who's passionate, oftentimes a movie star, or they'll bring out a politician who's up for re-election. These are the people that tell you how the earth functions, which makes it really quite painful because they're not a neutral position, they have no technical basis, but they'll tell you exactly what's going on. For the oil industry, I think it's a big problem that there's no equivalent to the airline industry's NTSB. If we were to crash a 747, put American on the tail, Boeing's got a problem, American Airlines has a problem. When that crash happens, they've got a whole bunch of people that are really unhappy that all their relatives have just gotten killed. Neither one of those companies is coming out to say, we're going to figure out what happened, we're going to make sure that you guys are taken care of. Financially, they're going to do that. They're liable. But they don't have to communicate that. And the public, if they had to communicate that, would go, well, yeah, you're liable. You're going to try to bury what happened and make it look like it wasn't you. There's nothing like that for the oil industry, and so on a technical basis, when something happens, and you have the Mayflower accident over in Arkansas where you had pipeline break and crude running down a driveway, really bad video for the oil company, and they had to come out and go, trust us, we'll clean this up and we'll make sure we don't have this happen again, or we'll try to make sure it doesn't happen again. And everybody goes, I don't buy that. And there's no neutral ref to say, yeah, actually it was an accident, or wow, they were being really negligent. There's no party that exists for that. It's all a really painful relationship between the public and the energy companies. And so that makes it quite painful to talk about these topics, because it's really hard to find somebody to say, well, what really is going on? And there's all these lawyers involved, which usually doesn't speed things up all that much. Additionally, there's been research. The research here is from the nuclear industry. Once you lose people's trust, no matter how many nice commercials you put on TV, they don't trust you very quickly. And the nuclear industry, people still don't trust. And as the oil industry loses trust in the state based on earthquakes, some nice commercials to say, hey, we're technically competent people, we'll sort this out for you, is not going to sell anybody. And so these things have been true, but they don't help the situation. As far as I go, I'm kind of a weird guy. I moved here in 2000 just waiting for earthquakes to start. I actually normally do geophysics associated with looking at water supply, looking at contaminants. And so I blend doing physics with doing water. And have done that for a number of years. I've got a company that takes stuff that I developed at the university and applies that commercially, so I understand running companies as well as understand being a professor. I've done a bunch of very geeky things in my time. As an undergraduate, I built a seismograph. Not a good thing for picking up potential spouses, but it was a fairly useful learning experience. So people do geeky things like that. I came in around here when the average in Oklahoma was about 1.6 earthquakes a year greater than magnitude 3. And on TV, people were saying, Oklahoma's earthquake country. No, we weren't. We didn't really get seismographs to the mid-70s because we never had earthquakes. It wasn't interesting enough around here to really do a lot of monitoring. There was a little bit of seismicity back in the 50s. There's some questions about where that came from. But if you watch Oklahoma, there wasn't much going on. About 2009, it got a little more interesting. Last couple of years have been really interesting. And last year, I put that as about 904. It's sloppy to count these things. On earthquakes, when we measure a 3, one guy might get 3.1, one might get 2.9. There's a little bit of slop in that. And it depends on a couple different factors, but a 3 is about a 3. On a regulatory basis, now Oklahoma has rules for what a 4 means. Well, scientifically, we're still going, 3.9, 4.1. Well, if it's 3.9, it wasn't a problem. If it's 4.1, it's a problem. And so now you've got people going, are you guys fudging these numbers? We've never been regulatory with these numbers for having a perfect line. And so when they do these counts, it depends on which group did the analysis as to, is it a little higher or a little lower, because there's some that cross the line and don't quite make it on one side or the other. But somewhere around a lot more than 1.6. So we've had a lot of seismicity, and people have noticed. Magnitude 3 is usually listed because in California, that's about when you feel them. Oklahomans can tell you, I can feel a lot smaller than 3. And there's also a lot of variability in what people feel. So one person's house, they go, we're having a lot of them. The person next door goes, a lot of what? They don't feel anything. And so there's a lot of variability, which makes, well, my neighbor must be nuts. They say the house is shaking all the time. I haven't felt a thing. And then, well, these aren't even 3s. What are you feeling? And the difference is that we have a different type of earthquake than in California, different type of rocks. And so we feel smaller numbers than you feel in California, but we're reporting them built around the science that we did for California. So they usually report them relative to 3. We should probably report them relative to somewhere in the 2s if we're going to talk about things that people felt. And so you'll also see numbers like, well, we had 5,000 earthquakes last year. And that's because they're reporting them on a smaller number. I just report them as based on one number, we've got a lot more now. This started happening back in here. The state figured it out in 2015 on a formal basis. Okay. So in April of 2015, they said it's very likely these are triggered by the injection of produced water in disposal wells, which we'll talk about, and the governor in August figured that out. So it took some time for the state to sort out the technical side of this versus the sensation people were feeling. There's a number of mechanisms people talked about. Well, this is purely natural. It just happens once in a while, and it's shaking here, and it'll move up to Iowa soon. There's a lot of great statements that are made, and the statements I try to make in this talk are built around peer-reviewed evidence that is supported by the scientific community, not stuff that somebody heard in a coffee shop and it sounded good to them. So Oklahoma is not earthquake country. There's no sense that this is natural. It's generated by injecting petroleum wastewaters at depth. And if you say, well, you know, at least 1.6 per year on average are natural, fine. There might be some caused by actual fracking, because you can actually make a couple small earthquakes, and there's some debate about it. Fine, take a few more for that. There might be some from draining out the reservoir versus injection. Fine, take a few for that. You know what, I'll give you 10 times as many as we should have. I'll give you 160 of them. You still got 800 more to explain. And that's contributed by injection wells at a high rate. So in terms of mechanisms, peer-reviewed basis is that it's injected petroleum wastewaters. Is there uncertainty in that? Indeed there is. Is it because we're not really good scientists? No, it's because we don't actually measure anything at depth. So if they say, well, you know, you've not tested this at depth. That's right, we never collected any data at depth to test this in those particular locations. Well, obviously you don't know everything exactly perfectly. That's true, we don't, because we've never measured it, because the state never funded us to measure that, and nobody's looked. And I don't know if people want to look or not want to look, but it leaves some uncertainty in the conclusion that people have really tried to play on, saying, we're not completely certain, and if we wait for the science, we'll find it out. Well, if nobody ever takes a measurement, the science will never happen. And so it's a great way to say, once that happens, something we're never planning on doing, we'll be able to make a decision, and allows you to push that decision out as long as you please. If you're going to build an earthquake machine with injection wells, you take a class 2 injection well. It goes in at some rate, some amount of volume, and some amount of timing. Timing is kind of a weird one people don't think about as much, but we recently had an ice storm here this winter, and all the wells got shut off because the power went out. Now I'll flip them back on at the same time and shook the ground. So how you turn them on and off is something. And so when people have said, okay, you can have this much injection, we've actually had to say, and don't wait for Friday to put it all in there. That's very different than if you spread it out over the week. And so how you put it in the ground, at what rate, what volume, what timing, affects how you make those earthquakes. That machine's innards, you'd measure things like where the faults are at, understand what the rocks underneath Oklahoma look like, understand the fluid distribution and their pressures down there and the stress field. We don't measure any of that. We find out where the faults are at by having earthquakes and go, oh, there's a fault. But most of our faults slide rocks past each other. And so if you go, well, you should use seismic. Seismic's not great for seeing rocks that slide past each other. It's good for seeing rocks that slide up and down because it makes different rocks set next to other rocks. Sliding past each other, it's not that easy to see them. And most of them, people have said, yeah, if we look at where the earthquakes were and go back to the seismic, yeah, we still didn't see where those were at until the earthquakes happened. So measuring these things we're not actively doing. If you want to manage this effectively and pump as hard as you can and not cause earthquakes, you typically would want to know more details about what's in there. We're really quite uncertain about those details because we haven't made that investment. Out of the machine comes earthquakes. You get the number on the TV that tells you the Richter magnitude or a magnitude number, and there's some slop to that, but basically you get some number out of that, which occurs at some depth, usually fairly shallow for us here. That little shaking then gets attenuated and you feel something on the surface. That's the thing that's important to the public, but to report that, we usually give this magical number here, which means something to people in California because they've gotten that number for years. When you do the same number here, it's a different number, and that's caused some confusion. Up here, we're going to do Richter magnitude down here. We'll attenuate that, and we'll get what did you feel, and there's something called did you feel it. The USGS takes recordings of what you felt. If you guys have an earthquake that you feel, you can go on the USGS website, click that. It'll bring up a little box in the corner and say, did you feel it? And you click that, and it'll ask you a set of questions to figure out what size sensation did you have and categorize that. That is the way that we figure out what our attenuation is, and that's the legal distribution of what people are feeling for each earthquake. People report the big ones, and we get lots of data on that. People don't record the little ones, and the little ones are really important, and the ones that cause damage are really important. So if you have little ones that you're feeling, report those. Those are quite important. And if you've got ones that caused cracks or damage, those are quite important to report. Because there's people in the engineering community that says, well, we've looked at the numbers, and relative to California, you didn't get a crack. It's right there. Yes, but our table says it didn't crack. It says your building wouldn't. But my house just cracked after that earthquake. Yes, but our table says it didn't. So by recording that data, it allows us to get the new data to say how do the earthquakes respond around here versus California. The scale used for that's called the Mercalli index. Those are in Roman numerals. These are in regular numbers. So we'll look at that a little more too. Building a disposal well. Disposal wells are meant to do just that, get rid of things. We used to put hazardous waste above the water table. It didn't take us long to go, well, that's a really dumb idea. So we didn't do that. You can't do class 4 now. Class 2 is brines from oil and gas fields and getting rid of that water at depth. There's other types. There's now a class 6 for CO2 injection. So these are legal categories for what you're doing there. What the goal is here is to get this water that's really salty, put it down. In our case, we're actually putting it even down below where the oil's at. Some people dispose of it above the oil. We're sticking it below the oil. But what you're trying to do is get it below what's called the base of fresh water or the base of drinking water. The idea is this stuff is really salty. If it gets in your water's going to go bad. You'll have a bad well or you'll have bad surface water. When we first started, we put it in the stream and said, go on. And we still actually have remnants from that practice back in the 30s. We can still see salt coming into streams from doing that way back when. So the whole goal of this was we're going to protect this fresh water at the top and put it way down where nobody's drinking. And back in the 50s, the concept of if you put it down deep enough, it magically goes away was a pretty strong concept. In the modern day, we don't know of many things that actually magically go away. It goes somewhere. So you've got to think about where it's actually going. So if you go on the Kansas Geologic Society, they have a good history of this. And this was developed in this area in actually the same formation that we're having trouble with. And it was put down into what's called the Arbuckle. And originally, they had people with little ranches and things. A young Bob Dole was drinking water that went salty. And they said, you know, we probably shouldn't leave this at the surface. So what they did was they came up with this disposal wells. And that you then built things around that. And the modern one looks something like this. And the company there said, could you at least put properly engineered so that they know it's a correct one? And that's great. This was a design that you would do to say, hey, I want to protect fresh water at the surface. So it's got a secondary containment, it's well maintained, and it's got all the things to make sure salty stuff that comes up out of the ground gets put back down below the oil field. Really useful concept except for some seismic issues. So we've done this for a very, very long time, since the 1930s. We built regulations on how to do that. We built all that stuff. We made forms. We made regulators. All those pieces and parts got built. I've gotten calls by the press, and they said, we read the form. We think they're trying to make earthquakes. The form came a long time before the earthquakes. So they're not trying to hide something in the form. It just was built for a different purpose. So they said, okay, well, what we'll do is stick this down in this chunk of Oklahoma. And this is looking at cutting Oklahoma through north-south. If we look at profile there, Arbuckle Mountain's sticking up here. If you're driving over I-35, you can see them stick up and out of there. Over here, it's a mile deep, give or take. and we're going to go stick it down at what's the bottom of the continent. Down below that is this granite. That granite is called the basement rock, and we call that the bottom of our continents, and that's the basement. That's where the earthquakes are happening. And basement rock is really good for making earthquakes, and that's unfortunate for us. In terms of understanding this basement, we're pretty primitive. We've been doing really high-tech geology over in the East African Rift. We understand that basement better than we understand ours. There's a lot of data we could collect that we've never collected in Oklahoma that is more modern methods than were applied when we originally looked at these rocks. But people don't make money down there. People are just disposing of something. So the sense that we should make a big investment to understand it hasn't been particularly important prior to now. In terms of the state's response, anytime a state responds to anything, there's pros and cons, and they have meanings that people take in. So I'm going to walk through some of them. You can decide whether I'm being honest or not. But things that move things forward is they came up with a stoplight system to say, hey, if you're shaking, we should do something. And there's protocols in a stoplight system that says, if these things happen, do these things, and then adjust. They've done a lot of reworking and shut down a lot of wells. Some of those shutdowns were, yeah, you told us we got to slow down, but we're near enough an earthquake area, our company doesn't want to mess with it, so we're just going to shut it down. And that varies from company because the number I heard was about 92 companies that are in the earthquake zone. Some of those companies own maybe one injection well. If you said shut down that well, that company goes away. They're not real interested in doing that. If it's a big giant corporation and they own 1,000 injection wells, shutting down one injection well, we don't want the problem with earthquakes, just shut it down. And so there's different sort of social setups on whether that works for you. There's a council on seismic activity, and I'm on it. It was formed such that we don't have to meet Open Meeting Act regulations. I didn't do that, but that was the way it was set up. I'm not a politician. I don't understand these things, but I sit on that council. They've also put out a web page. The web page does a good job of telling you things that you want to know, and if there's something that's not on the web page that you go, the state needs to know that, and yeah, the public needs to know that, they will try to get that put up there and let me know if there's something missing from that website that you go, you guys aren't talking about this. So that website is a pretty professional website. Things that made the state go backwards, well, you're getting earthquakes, you guys should really study this, you guys should really regulate this, and the way we'll do that is we'll cut your funding. It doesn't make you feel like the state is wanting to solve a problem when they're cutting the budget of the people that are supposed to solve a problem. There aren't maximums set on injection. Compliance has been voluntary, and all the companies have been complying at various rates, but most of them basically comply instantaneously. Some of them say, that's a problem, can we chat about that? Because technically we've got some issues and we think we've got a better solution. Can we chat about this? And that's caused some people to go, what are they doing? And it's, well, they know their field and they know what the choices are a little better sometimes than the state might. And so getting that worked out takes some time sometimes. There's people saying, you know, this is a really active seismic area and I've got a lease there. Can I put another hole? You realize this is shaking. People are really upset. You might have liability. I know, but my lease is going to go up. I need a hole there. You need to approve that as a state. And I don't think that's made the public feel real comfortable that the industry that's got issues with this is going, yeah, you guys got to get over that because I've got work to do. That there's not a sense of, yeah, we better back off and think about what's going on here and maybe chat with how the legal side works with leases and try to work this out in a different way. There's people with stacks of applications saying, I want to be right in the seismically active zones. And then a couple seismologists work for the state left. That doesn't help things. They take the knowledge with them. And there's also suspicion about, well, why are you quitting? Isn't it lovely to work here during an earthquake area, in an earthquake area that's getting really, really active? Isn't that a great research thing? Why do you want to quit your job? So that makes it not so good. This, as of January, next slide is going to change, but as of January of this year, this was the earthquake zone, and these are the disposal wells. Research says out of this about 550 some odd wells, close to 600 somewhere, count the dots, it's probably 30 of them, maybe 20 of them that are causing the earthquakes. The science question is, which magic dots is it? And you'd have to do some work on that, filling in that data inside the earthquake machine to go, that's a bad one, that's a bad one, and do some work like that. In areas where they've had fewer wells, where they've had maybe 5 or 10 wells, they've done that kind of work and figured out you're the guy and shut that off. We haven't had that luxury because the data wasn't available. So when changes are made, it's, hey, you guys, shut that down a bit or shut them all off. And it's not done in a sort of a high-tech manner. It's done in sort of a brute force way. This area seems to have been shaking a bit. New Year's Day, I was sitting at home, and I've got a new phone that tells you that the caller ID is there, and it says, National Public Radio. They're asking for money on New Year's Day? You guys have been shaking this morning. Can we interview you? Yeah, okay. And they're looking for somebody to provide some answers, and it's a holiday, so I'm going, how'd you find my home phone number? But I guess I'm in the book. But you guys have been shaking a lot. And so what happened is you got one of the new zones. So this brown line says, okay, if you're a dot in there, you're shutting down. We're gonna drop you by 40%. If you're only injecting at really tiny rates, we're not going to mess with that. It's these guys that are injecting at really high rates. You guys have got to drop your levels. In terms of which wells it is, probably 4 to 10 wells in there that are the interesting ones. We don't know which ones they are. We don't have the science. So we're just saying, if you're in that box, you got to drop down. That's going to happen in 4 phases. They're going to lower it 25% at a shot, with the last phase ending on April 30th. So by April 30th, that whole region will have 40% less injection going into it. Yep.
That's mandated through the Corporation Commission?
Yes. And so those changes, when they first started getting made, weren't super fast because they were like, what's that letter look like? What's the legal side of that letter look like? What's the company, how do they want to receive that letter? It's gotten a lot faster because the companies go, we're getting another one of those letters. This is the new area. You want us to do this. And so that's going a lot smoother. That blue line on the last chart was this red line here. So that's got expanded out. And this whole area is now under that new area of volume reduction. So by April 30th, it's 40% lower, and we'll see what happens. There's still not significant investment in trying to figure out what the pressures look like down there or those details to be more sophisticated than that. In terms of modifications that have already happened, that design was built for fresh water being protected, and that basically says design the top of this well with very strict regulations. The bottom of the well was, do what you want. And what that meant was when they drilled down into the Arbuckle right above the basement, a lot of times as they're drilling, they hit the basement. They go, oh, yep, we got granite. And they would call the OCC and say, hey, we hit the granite. Is that a problem? No, did you design the top right? Yeah, we've done that right. Well, I don't care about the bottom. What is that a problem for? That's a problem if you're making earthquakes. And so what they did was they said, you guys have to make those meet seismic standards now. They go, well, but we designed it how you told us to do it. Yeah, I know, but we're having earthquakes now. So that money that was invested of probably about $45 million cost you about $200,000 a well to do that. 222 have been plugged back. Means that they went in and filled in that bottom over some distance to make sure they weren't connected to that granite, or at least tried to make the connection really, really poor. Other ones, they weren't in the granite. They reduced volumes. They were injecting very, very tiny amounts. There's a bunch of injection wells that are just sitting there that aren't doing much. They're not injecting at all, or they're shut in. They're not actually active. So and those wells for a while, it was the OCC sitting there and going, had an earthquake. Let's go look at those wells. And it basically became, wow, you've got so many dots lighting up that there's no way you've got people to do this. And so they finally went and said, you companies, tell us if you meet this spec. if you don't meet the spec, you've got to change it. And so those changes have been occurring, but it's taking a bit, and in some cases it's helped a lot. In some cases, maybe not so much. This chunk around Guthrie has been really active, and you see sort of the fault running through there. And they're going, you know, if you look at the dots there, we weren't injecting a huge amount. And when you look at these across the country, some wells don't have to do a lot to have good earthquakes. If you're in the right spot, you can cause problems too. And so figuring out those details, we don't have the details, so we did the, this was called the hoagie by people at the OCC. I call it the Band-Aid. But the Band-Aid area, instead of saying, let's study these wells, or let's figure out which ones are controlling this, it's just drop everything down, would you? And they go, well, we're not injecting that much. I know, but just drop everything down. It's a fairly brute force approach. If we look at making your own earthquakes, there's been people that have talked about, you know, you can't, man's not powerful enough to make an earthquake. Man's been doing it for over 100 years. So we started in 1890s. South African miners started making earthquakes, and they still have troubles to this day. And a buddy of mine in South Africa said, if you guys do that project, you're going to make like maybe a 5.5. And they said, no, we've checked it. It's only going to be a 3.5. And the 5.5 rolls through, and they go, you know something, don't you? And these things are problematic to predict. You don't want to get into earthquake prediction too much because you can get arrested. Some Italians had been trying to predict them, and they had a little village that said, you know, when we get these signs, it usually means there's going to be a good-sized earthquake, and we usually just go live outside for a couple weeks. Should we do that? And instead of saying, our data says the odds are kind of small, and giving them percentage odds and these sorts of things like seismologists usually do, they said, no, I don't think you're having one. Well, they had one, and a bunch of people died. So they got convicted of manslaughter and thrown in jail. So people are a little sensitive about predicting earthquakes. I don't predict them. I'll tell you we're probably going to still have some, but I won't tell you when and try to do those things. We've got them from petroleum production, from making large dams, and people have talked about this. You know, Lake Arcadia is making earthquakes. Large dams are like 300-foot tall dams. The Hoover Dam, that makes earthquakes. Little lakes around Oklahoma aren't usually in the category. Now, if you're making earthquakes down below it and you add some more weight on the top, you might kick something over, but it's not, our lakes aren't the size that we're normally worried about being the primary contributor to making earthquakes. But people have talked about that a lot, and I've heard our earthquakes are caused by rain. I've heard our earthquakes are caused by drought. And it's really interesting because Oklahoma's gone through drought and has gone through floods and never had 900 earthquakes. But suddenly, now that we're having lots of seismicity, it rained. It's not a new thing to rain in Oklahoma. It's not a new thing to be dry. But through sets of years, 2011 was pretty dry and we had earthquakes. Last year was pretty wet, we had earthquakes. But we can check how much mass you're adding, and we don't have enough. So these earthquakes came out of, we had an injection well in Colorado for the DOD, and they said, we've got some really nasty stuff to get rid of from World War II. What do you want to do with it? Let's put it down as far as we can. So they drilled down into the basement rocks under Colorado, and they said, well, can it take any fluid? And we can measure, are you full? Are you still empty? Are you over full? And we talk about it as being overpressured, underpressured, or we're at hydrostatic. And we could talk about how full we are. And they said, this has got plenty of room. So they started shoving the stuff down there and started making earthquakes. And they actually had a monk at St. Regis University, had his own seismograph. And I don't know why, but I talked to a history professor. Jesuit monks had seismographs. So the Jesuits said, you know, somebody's making earthquakes here. And the DOD said, not us. But they shut down their well, and they said, I don't think it's us. What do you got for data? Yeah, I don't think it's us. And they turned it back on again. They made more earthquakes. So I said, I think we're making it with an injection well. And an oil company said, we think we're making them too. And so, very contrary to the modern day, back in the 60s, the oil company and the USGS got together. The oil company handed over its wells and said, can you guys play with these and figure out if these are making earthquakes? And so they ran an experiment where we actually took a couple guys, we turned the valve, made the earthquakes, pumped back, and turned them off within one day. And we wrote that up as beyond a reasonable doubt, we can make earthquakes. We can turn on the valve, and then we can pump it back, pull that fluid back, and turn them off. So we know we can do that. And it was written up as an experiment in earthquake control. If you read that paper, they were going to go along the San Andreas, punch a bunch of ejection wells, and slide San Francisco along. We thought we could do that in the 70s. San Francisco has not signed up for our program. But these are the injection wells, and there's some earthquakes around there. There's also these earthquakes down in the basement, and there's a disconnect between them. We have good science to say that we made these. This connection is not super well understood. Okay, so it'd be great. A lot of scientists want to drill a set of wells and watch what's happening there, or do that in Oklahoma. These wells cost money because they're at depth, but it's been done. We've made our own earthquakes. This is the beyond a reasonable doubt case. That's at about 2.3 million gallons a month they were injecting at. If we look at that pattern, the black ones are the ones that are close to the injection wells. And so the pattern is most of them aren't close to the injection wells. And so people want the pattern to be, hey, Acme, you've got your well, there's an earthquake right next to you, obviously you made that. It's not how the patterns ever worked. In our best case scenario case where we had beyond a reasonable doubt standard and we can play with the earthquakes, they happen pretty far away from the injection well, and it makes it hard to figure out the pattern because in Oklahoma, you're always close to an injection well. It was something like 78% odds you're within 15 miles of an injection well. So when you go, hey, you had an earthquake, are you close to an injection well? Yep. So figuring that out, the pattern is not something that's friendly and nice. These guys been running earthquake machines since the 90s. Okay? And what they had was, they had a great name for their valley. They're in Paradox Valley. Their paradox was, you can have some earthquakes or you can have clean water. That's our choice? Yeah, we can make the water clean, but we're going to make some earthquakes to do that. Can I get clean water and no earthquakes? No. Okay, I'll take earthquakes. And they've been running this earthquake machine, and it's done a few things that they expected. It's done a few things they haven't expected. It's made some ones that are bigger than they really wanted. They've been getting up around 4s. And then it moves out over time. And that's a pattern that's been consistent among these things. They'll move away from the injection well over time. And so for Oklahoma, we've been running this machine now for several years, asking to figure out, for that earthquake, which well was it? It's further and further away from the well of interest over time. So the problem gets harder as you go. We call that the Kaiser effect. This is a numerical simulation of that. And so over time here, you're increasing rates. At those rate changes, you get a kick in the number of earthquakes. And then the distance the earthquakes are occurring keep moving away. So that pattern is something that makes it more complicated to sort out as well. They don't necessarily care where you're injecting. They're moving at where the faults are. And the faults that move keep moving away over time. So the pattern for this problem is not nice, simple, inject, made an earthquake, shut that one off. It's never that friendly. And in our problem, we've got, oh, and stick a couple hundred wells right around that too. So now figure out which one it is. And it's about as complicated as you could get. And that's our case. There's other people that have similar situations, and Oklahoma is looked at as a more conservative place. Holland is looked at as a more liberal place, so they should approach the problem politically completely differently. It's almost identical. And the Dutch came over, they were interested in how we were dealing with it, and they said, we've got a bunch of people living in a rural area that are having earthquakes and the government is ignoring them. I'm like, that sounds very similar to Oklahoma. So the politics doesn't matter a lot. Their politics are a little different in that it's one company running the big thing, and that company is pretty well tied to the government because the government asked them to produce this field. So that consortium is producing it, and this isn't from injection, this is from gas production. They've produced so much gas there that Holland's sinking a little bit and making earthquakes. But their biggest is about a 3.6, and they've had lots of damage. People have lost their homes. They've had a collapsed real estate market, and they've had some settlements. They've paid out 1.2 billion euros to the people on top of that, and there's another court case for another 5 billion euros in play. So there's other people dealing with this around the planet, and they come and chat to us in Oklahoma, and I get to translate to other languages, which is very strange. There's rules for this. This criteria came up with in the early 90s. So people say, you know, we got to figure out how to do this problem. It's a brand new problem. We played with valves back in the 60s. We came up with rules back in the 90s. This isn't new. But one thing is, are you disposing in or near the basement? Yes. Oh, stop that. Well, that's where we dispose of a lot of this stuff. Yeah, that's a problem. Well, we didn't know it was a problem when we allowed people to dispose down there. Is it a high-impact site? Yes. Well, stop that. Well, I'm going to guess your house is considered to you a high-impact site. Versus these nice flow charts go, well, like a city. Don't do that near a city. People will get upset. Well, it turns out people that are living in a farm get pretty upset too. So making these little flow charts is nice, but high impact means a lot to somebody in the country. I was raised in the country, and I can tell you I wouldn't like earthquakes even though I didn't live in a city. So thinking about whether you're disposing near a fault. Are you already a seismically active area? No. Are you at a place with epicenters? Yes. And so that's where the stoplight system comes in. This one's the real tricky one. Is your disposal coincident with seismicity? I don't know. Maybe. One of these guys. So there's things you can do, but it doesn't quite fit the pattern of Oklahoma, and so it's a bit tricky to deal with. The injection rates, that Rangeley site, where we did the best case, we're at 2.3 million gallons a month. These other cases with the disposal for DOD, there was a study down in the Barnett, down in Texas. That's the kind of rates they were injecting to make earthquakes. And it varies geologically, but the rates that we had publications come out for Oklahoma, the publication would be very interesting to say, I injected at a rate 73 times higher than the Rangeley site, and I didn't make an earthquake. Saying that they made an earthquake when you're injecting that hard is not that great of a conclusion. But people were challenging these papers saying, there's no way we're making earthquakes. On a science base, you go, how do you inject 73 times higher than the best cases that we've got and not make them? Demonstrate the mechanism for not making them. So we weren't doing something right at the border of something. We were blasting the formation. And that's what has been getting shut down since that started. But what we're not doing is looking outside of the seismic zone going, you're not shaking yet, but how hard are you injecting? We're not doing that kind of proactive approach. We're doing, okay, we're shaking, let's turn something down. And that's the approach we're taking right now. In terms of the science summary, there's a lot of science. One of the things that's key is people go, well, you know, the Arbuckle is under pressured. You can put a bunch of water down there. That's great, but it's not how much pressure you have, it's how much you changed it. And the changes, there's some publications that say it's as little as 15 psi change at the right spot in a fault, and you'll move it. And next Friday, we've got one of the people that model this stuff coming to OSU, and she's going to be presenting some of that work and looking at how that mechanism works. But we could do it in the computer. We don't have a lot of field data for it. One key thing that we do for figuring out what your building is going to be built on is do hazard mapping. USGS has done this for a very, very long time. This is used by the architectural community. And you can then look up, I want to do this address in Alva, Oklahoma, and it'll tell you this is the magic number. And this magic number comes out of this kind of map where it says, if you're in this part of California, your house might move sideways. If you're in this part of Missouri, your house might move sideways. This part of Oklahoma has been listed as really boring. And so the houses are built for, not much is going to happen there. The problem with induced seismicity is they were taking the induced earthquakes out of this analysis because they said, well, this is for the earth moving, not for us making earthquakes. And so the little boxes here are places they said, oh yeah, we're not going to count those. You see this big box for Oklahoma. There's been a second box put up here that's not on this map, but we had to figure out even how to talk about that seismic hazard because it's not necessarily long-term hazard. If we shut off wells or make changes, we could turn off that hazard. And so these are 50-year maps at a 2% odds. What we're going to do now is make up 1-year maps at, I think, 1% odds. And those will be out on March 30th. Those are going to be released by the USGS. There should be news because Oklahoma is going to have a big red splotch saying you've got a seismic hazard. And most people in Oklahoma would go, I noticed that. But it's trying to figure out this relationship that is quite important. Is people want to know, on a Mercalli scale, how bad am I going to be shaking? On a Richter scale, what's the news going to report? So this relationship is built on California, basically. They say, just perceptible. A few people felt it, especially if you're on a tall building. 3. I can tell you there's a lot of things below 3 that people feel around Oklahoma. And it's just a different attenuation. So that attenuation relationship between what happened at depth and what you felt is quite different. So these numbers, you can modify them by about 1. So here where they say you're getting cracks and things like that, they're saying 5.5. That's our upper 4s are doing that kind of activity. And we think we might end up somewhere sort of in this zone where you got chimneys collapsing that happened in Prague. And we're worried about getting up into this range. That's most of the predictions. And you can look around and decide what the hazards are. And you can actually do hazard modelings to say, I know I have this fault in Oklahoma, and I can then do predictions of if it did these things, how big of an earthquake would come out, and who would be damaged in what way. And so there's that science to do that type of modeling that's not being done for the state right now. But the expectation is we can get up into about this range with these earthquakes. You guys have felt plenty up into this range, and some up into this range. So that's going to be built on these data sets. So the USGS has a southern Oklahoma, a northern Oklahoma chunk. Around Dallas, there's a chunk. There's one out here in West Texas. There's this New Mexico. There's this other one over here. There's 17 of these zones across the U.S.
Is there a fault that runs from Nebraska through Kansas down into
So that's the Nemaha. And what you're going to look for is...
another one to the west?
I could check the fault map for you. What you want to look for is Oklahoma's basically getting shoved on the sides. And so the fault that is like this, you go, well, I don't care, because it's basically getting shoved close. What the bad ones are this direction and this direction. Those are the guys that want to go. And so when you look at the lineup of little dots when they start to happen on the map, they're following these 2 orientations. And so what you want to look for around here are faults that follow that direction. There's one that's heading at about 311 degrees. That is a little south of here that's been moving. That's the one that did the 5-1. So that map will be out, and it'll be on the USGS website. It's in peer review right now. It'll be out on March 30th, I believe. According to USGS, who's quite panicked about releasing it, there should be a fair bit of news coverage of that release. You can also do analysis. We happen to have one of the world's largest oil storage facilities in Cushing, and so we can do analysis of a particular site that just happens to have a fault crossing right underneath. All those little white dots are big giant oil storage tanks. And so they did an analysis of this one, and McNamara said, yeah, you could make a Prague size event that happens to occur immediately underneath your large oil storage facility with all the pipeline crossings. Yeah.
Do we have salt water coming in from our neighboring states?
You do.
How much?
It's not a huge amount, and the reason that it's not a huge amount is salt water is heavy. And so you burn a lot of cash moving it. And so if you're trucking it, it's costing you a lot to dispose of it versus putting in a well very close to where you're producing it. And so there's stuff coming across the lines. People can decide whether that's good or bad, or whether that should be taxed or something. But on a physical basis, it weighs a lot, so it's not a huge number relative to the amount of disposal that's occurring.
But we are accepting it.
We are accepting it. And if you don't want to accept it, let somebody in the little buildings down in Oklahoma City know, and you might get that changed. In terms of doing these kind of hazard assessments, they look at how much would this area change or move sideways. They do that relative to G, and that's the acceleration due to gravity. If you fell out of a plane, you go 1 G. And so they go, okay, well, we'd expect intensities that are about 1/4 to 1/3 G. You might also get things that are bad. So there's places that we're sensitive about now. But we've got some data, we're missing others. This is comparing one map in California relative to one map or in Oklahoma. These are both 4.8s. On the news, they're the same earthquake. These guys felt light shaking at a 4 on the Mercalli. Here we were 2 notches bigger and a strong. And this is reported from 393 people in different zip codes going on the USGS website, reporting what they felt. It'll ask you silly questions like, did your pictures tilt? Did you hear glasses tinkling? Did you get woken up? Did you get knocked out of bed? And you do that, and it comes up with one of these numbers, and when you map out hundreds of people, you get a really clear pattern. But they're using that pattern to figure out the attenuation relationship, which at some point lawyers will probably use to say these people should have been damaged. And so the small ones are quite important to report. The big ones get a lot of people to report them, but the small ones are important. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned that one person may be in their home and not feel anything, and their neighbor feels something. We've only felt 2, and some of those were the biggest ones, and we barely felt them, but people clear out in Liberal and all over were feeling them. Is that because of where our house is located? Or
You're well attenuated. So, congratulations. My house is very poorly attenuated, so yours, I feel. I'm right along a fault, and the energy comes down and goes.
We're actually like between 2 saltwater disposal wells.
Yeah, and that's the pattern, and so
we barely have felt anything. So it's just, is it the structure, or is it the ground under us, or what is?
So these tend to be shallow, and it affects the way that energy propagates, and so you get then these patterns that can get. This pattern is built on people that are reporting it. There's probably lots of people nearby that said, I didn't feel anything. And so that's part of the pattern.
When you say shallow, they don't report the depth of these earthquakes very often.
They do, but oftentimes the depth is not so great.
Is it above the basement inlet?
Typically, it's in the shallow part of it's in the just below the shallow part of the basement. There's actually a shallow bit, and then it's the second notch down is where they usually are at. But we've gotten much better because now, I mean, we used to have a few seismographs around. Now we have lots and lots of seismographs around. And there's actually 2 types that are being deployed. One is, I want to feel the little stuff. And so the public has those, universities have those, and the companies have those. And that way, if they've got a well going and they're worried about this, they can put a seismometer there and go, I'm making like 1s or making -1s. If I drop this can, I can make a -3 and make a mess too. If you have a soccer game, there was people working in Africa and they got really weird little earthquakes, and they figured out it was every time they scored in the World Cup. When 9/11 happened, those buildings fell down. We had the earthquakes. We could tell you when it happened and something about how the explosion happened. So anything that makes a noise is an earthquake. So if they've got a seismograph there, some of the companies have their own seismographs, and they go, we're making like some 1s. Let's change something. And they've got that. They want that technical capability. So there's those people monitoring now all over the place, and so our ability to figure out the depth is getting much better. And that's the hardest. You can figure out X, Y, and figure out where it's at on the surface, but figuring out which depth is actually pretty hard unless you got a lot of seismometers. And now we have that. And a whole bunch just got installed around here in the last 2 weeks.
Are you going to get to work with the Cambridge well because they donated so you could study what's going on down there?
So OGS is going to be working with those wells. And so they're going to be then putting in some pressure transducers and trying to actually get some data on what's happening down in the machine, which would be nice. It would have been great if they said, you know, in 2011, this is looking like it might be a problem. Let's start doing something. It would have been great to start getting the data back then. But we'll probably start getting it now. And the companies, as much as everybody goes, it's the big bad oil companies, have been, you want some more data? Can you guys study this stuff? And can you get us some information? And they've been quite good at wanting to sort out the problem, but they've also got legal issues. And the lawyers say, you tech guys, you can't say that. And so there's legal boundaries between the tech. all the technical people would like to do a kumbaya and say, hey, can we sort this out? But the lawyers give us some boundaries. So options, status quo, we're currently trying to reduce seismicity. There's not a lot of funding for science or the agencies. There's been a little bit more money put in, and so that's the effort that's going. If you say we're not worried about earthquakes, we're fine, do what you need to do, people will install more injection wells and your seismic hazard will go up. Other things that could be done on the more intervention side, a fund to think about repair. The problem with that is a lot of these earthquake areas are also shrink swell clay areas with bad soil and guys that sell foundation services. So figuring out which crack came from an earthquake and which one came from a soil, it's hard to do. A management fund to say, you guys figure out how to run these earthquakes because the companies and the state haven't been working on this problem, so let's get some people that's their focus in life. I think it'd be really good to have a neutral referee that says, oil spill, oil problem, earthquake problem, neutral technical people, what's the right answer? I don't want the lawyers in the room. I want to know what the actual answer is now, because that'd be useful to everybody on all sides. If you want to figure out the earthquake machine in Oklahoma, you're going to spend some money. That's probably about a $50 million endeavor to figure out things at depth and get that figured out to go with injection rates that are safe and allow people to do production at reasonable levels. This is about what's been spent plugging back wells. So as an investment, it's a big number, but it's not a huge number relative to a multi-county machine that's being run.
Any sales tax on that.
Or an injection tax. There's different ways you can do that, but tax as a word in Oklahoma is not something people really like. So that would reduce the seismic hazard. It also, if you can get things where the energy industry interacts with the public better, such that when the oil price goes back up, it's not everybody feeling like their homes have been destroyed, they're having earthquakes, they're having contamination, that there's some better social structure that we develop, that would help out a lot for the country too. I do tell people to do earthquake drills. It's been problematic. I finally got my son's school to do one. And this website has the page of, you're a principal or you're a teacher and you got to run one of these. You don't have a clue. Step 1, step 500, step all these steps. Here's what to do with all the classes. Here's the sheets. You need some slides. Here's all the slides you need. Here's how to run an earthquake drill. You basically teach the kids to get down underneath the desk, hold on, wait till it stops shaking, then run out. Do not just jump out of your chair and start running, because that's a great way to get killed. Most people that die in earthquakes are actually running out of a building and bricks are falling on them. And the concept of standing in a doorway, that's not correct either. So if it was in this room, you'd duck down, grab one of the posts underneath one of these chairs and wait. And if you had a big earthquake here that was actually causing real damage, it might be shaking for 2-3 minutes. So you might have to hold on for a little while, but hauling out the door is the most dangerous thing you can do. So, but teaching kids to do this, they don't know what to do. And it's a real simple drill. It's very similar to a fire drill where you go, well, that wasn't that hard. But if you don't know, it's a problem then. So I encourage people to get their schools to do that. I found it's not easy to do, but the website's there. It's easy to do, but getting the schools to actually do it has been quite difficult. Bunch of people help out with that. Some of them I don't list by names to make sure that they don't get in trouble. But a lot of folks help out with this stuff. This is the website for the state that has, they try to be a one-stop source for information. And if there's something missing there that you go, I think the state's hiding something, let me know and I'll tell somebody. People think the state's hiding something. Put this up there. And thanks for your time. And got questions?
It's not just an injection in the Arbuckle. You don't think that's a problem unless you're getting way down towards the basement rock?
The Arbuckle is actually weird in a couple ways. If we look at the freshwater part in southern Oklahoma, we've got better data there, and it says that rock wants to actually push water up and down better than wants to push side to side. And so technically it'd be called vertically anisotropic, but if you inject water, going down is something that's happier doing than going sideways. And so even if you plug back, you might still have a connection to basement, but you could test that in some ways. So as a formation, it's not guaranteed that plugging back is going to fix the problem of getting disconnect from the basement. And then the faults we've seen tend to go right through the Arbuckle. The ones that are in the basement, they tend to go right through back and forth. And so it probably is relatively well connected to the basement.
So, if that's the case, do you see a lot of problems going ahead and injecting above what you call the oil interval, and it actually shallow depths?
It's going to be on a play-by-play basis. And
Todd, can you repeat the question?
would it be a problem then to switch from injecting at depth in the Arbuckle and switching to some of the other intervals? There's people looking at that, and the question is, if you get too shallow, are we going to get involved with the base of fresh water? And so people are looking at that sort of approach. Injection wells is about the cheapest way to deal with water. One of the things that I talk about is people understand dry holes. They understand that back in the day, you drill a hole, there was no oil there, you lost. You spent however many millions of dollars cost to put that hole in the ground, no oil came out of it, you lost. Sorry. I think there's also a category of a wet hole where per barrel of oil, you got way too many barrels of water, and you lost. And yeah, you could cheaply inject that all, but out of these 100 wells out here, you're going to be 50% of the volume. You lost, don't do it. And yeah, I'm sorry, you lost $10 million, but relative to causing seismicity for the other 100 wells around here, we're going to call we're going to call winners and losers. Just because it's cheap enough to inject doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Thank you. I've got a question. There are several applications by Mid-States Petroleum to convert producing Mississippi lime wells, horizontal wells, to disposal wells. Do you think that's feasible and a good idea? And secondly, if you're in that unit where you have to accept that disposal well, won't that dramatically reduce your produced hydrocarbon and just push it to the abutting sections?
So that's a petroleum engineering question of if you're basically going to convert the Mississippi lime is the production interval for a lot of this area around here. That's where they're getting the oil out of. And so if we inject it back into there, you're essentially converting it to a water flood operation. And so then you've got to look at where are the producers, where are the injectors, and what does that change for what the system is doing. But that one, typically you've got to get to reservoir simulation level where you're actually numerically modeling what's happening and getting good data on that, because otherwise you get things to happen that you go, oh yeah, that would happen. And if you don't do it well technically, you can really screw up the interval. So additional companies to the side and things would probably have a lot to say about people choosing to do that.
Okay.
So that one's a good idea. I'm not against that idea, but it's also technically not simple.
Having experienced a few of these earthquakes, and I noticed that some of them, people appear to hear or feel sound, and maybe only sound, or maybe none. You expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, so that's the wave coming out of the ground and making a noise. So if you stuck a bell at the surface and it shook it, you'd make it ring. You make the building ring, you make different parts of it make noise. And so for big earthquakes, people talk about hearing trains and stuff. And what you're hearing is the faults rupturing and coming towards you. And so the noises associated with them, people actually study to try to figure out what they all mean. But there's quite a variety of sound in these. And the ones around Stillwater actually change sound over time. And we used to get a lot of them that sounded like a car hitting the building and just a big noise. And then we've gotten kind of, the noise have gotten dull. And so it's been changing over time. So yeah, the noises are weird, but it's the wave interacting with the surface.
You had a slide with 555 wells on it and then some data about those wells, what's been plugged back, what's been reduced in volume, things like that. Is that all the wells in the state, or is that just the 555 wells in the area?
That's a table I started last summer with the categories. There's now a couple other categories that aren't particularly big of, there's a well that's this, this, and this, but it's like 6 or 7 of them, and the table got too big. But it's most of them in the seismically active area that have been dealt with. But I give that as a count that I got from OCC on those categories, but it's not a complete catalog. I'm trying to demonstrate there's a lot of them, and they fall under different things for trying to deal with the problem.
I want to talk about damage to buildings, at what magnitude of quake, and I think I heard you say that basically most of the damage occurs, 4.0 or above. That's what you hear from USGS as well. My experience, there's a lot of damage, much lower than that.
Right.
Is that accurate? I mean, what can we? My concern is we keep hearing everybody's like quoting USGS. Oh, well, damage doesn't occur below 4.0. My house was destroyed, and I've had maybe 2 or 3 above 4.0, but hundreds below that.
Right, and so the lawyers are asking me now because they're getting feedback from the engineering community, and the engineering community says you have no cracks. No, we've got a lot of cracks, and like the carpenters around Stillwater, they can tell you which neighborhoods have had a lot of damage because they know which homes are giving them a lot of calls, and they go in and they go, wow. And so there's some studies prior to this all happening. There's some studies in California of hitting buildings with a 6 and not damaging them, and watching, oh yeah, it didn't fall down, but that building is not structurally sound anymore. But the question is, here, have 100 threes. We're just going to keep pounding your building. Not very hard, but we're going to do it a lot. And so that's a question about how do buildings respond to that, and there's active research right now trying to figure out that answer. But the engineering community is split going, it won't do anything, and other engineers going, actually we designed them to absorb impacts so that it doesn't fall down and kill people, but it should be becoming uninhabitable over time. And so the engineering community is pretty unsettled on that as far as I can tell. But I'm not an engineer who builds buildings. But
when they have a earthquake, many times they say we discovered a new fault. How come that when they go through the countries with these seismic maps and all, doesn't that map the faults?
The hardest thing to see is the type of faults we've got. And so our faults tend to be strike slips, so the rocks slide past each other. And so it's sitting vertically. There's the same kind of rock on both sides, and there's a crack there. And so those are really easy to see. If you start sliding them like this, well, now you've got the formation at the bottom gets up against this other one here, and you got that little divot in the rocks, and you can see that quite well. And so those faults we can find really well. These, you usually find them by going, had an earthquake, you had a bunch more, oh, there's a fault. Okay. So we found one now through OSU's campus. We now know we have one running right through. So. So we're finding lots of them, and they're getting mapped out quite well.
Where do you report the damage from an earthquake to?
So if you go to the USGS website, so it's earthquake.usgs.gov, you can then go to the earthquake map. And so if it's just happened, and you go there, it shows like the last day's worth of earthquakes, and you can click the dot and go, that's the one I've got. That's the one I felt. And that's the one that caused damage. And then down in the corner, it'll say, did you feel it? DYFI. Click that, and it'll give you, would you like to report? And it'll ask you, if you want to give it your address, that's fine. If you go, I don't want to give it my address, it just wants your zip code. Where are you at zip code-wise so I can map this out a little bit? Earthquake.usgs.gov. Or if you type in Google USGS earthquakes, it'll get you to the site. And if you do USGS earthquakes DYFI, it'll get you really close to where you want to be.
How many have ever reported an earthquake?
I report them every time.
Great.
I was curious. That's useful data, though.
It's very useful data, especially if you live in the boondocks away from a town where somebody else might report. If you're the only person out there reporting, you can see there's all these gaps, and it's, well, nobody in that spot reported anything. So we don't know what they felt.
Well, we were about 6 miles from the big one. And I thought the Lord got tired of us coming back to get us. And that was a mess.
Yeah.
It shook our house. My neighbor got some pipes broke from it, under his house and stuff. That did.
Yeah.
sound and shaking like it can.
And how long did the shaking last?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we had the aftershocks.
Then you had the aftershocks, yeah.
How much of those are aftershocks, and how do they distinguish between an aftershock and another earthquake?
So that's actually a bit messy because on tectonic earthquakes, you had a big earthquake. What they usually do is go 6 or 9 months. We'll call anything that happened around there foreshocks and aftershocks. That doesn't work for us, and so it's called filtering issues. And they go, well, you have filtering issues. Yeah, we do. And so naming your foreshocks and aftershocks in Oklahoma is not as easy as occasional tectonic earthquakes. It can get worse because we are not near a plate boundary. And so if you look at earthquakes not near a plate boundary, we don't have lots of data for that. And there's a paper that came out by the guy who taught me seismology and the advisor of another guy who taught me seismology. And they said, oh, yeah, foreshocks and aftershocks for the New Madrid earthquake back in early 1800s. It's probably about 1,200-year window. So we'll just take 1,200 years and call that foreshocks and aftershocks. And so there's a lot about these that are, we don't have great certainty. And people that have tried to be really certain with earthquakes have always lost in terms of trying to make scientific predictions.
Where can I get one of these seismometers?
There's an app for that. It's a free app. There's several of them. And if I can hold my phone still enough, we have a 3-component seismograph. And we've actually had a student using this against real seismographs. He gets almost the same information. And these will record, depends on how much data you've got in your phone, it'll record. But if you set it up at night and you have an earthquake, you could have recorded your own seismograph of what your house felt.
What's the app?
This one was cheap because it was free. That's called Seismometer. Really advanced name. Letter I, Seismometer, because this is an iPhone. So, but if you go on any of the apps things, I think I had 4 or 5 show up, and at least one of them was free, and that's my price, so that's the one I took. But it allows me to do demos, and it's 3 components. So as you shake it the 3 different directions, if you get good at holding your hand steady, you can make the 3 different things have all the waves. You can also test. It's great for little kids because if you just set it there, it goes steady, and you can make your own earthquake. And if you get a bunch of kids jumping, they get really excited because they make bigger earthquakes.
You basically can't tell us that, yes, they're going to get worse and we're going to, the earth is going to open up and we're going to fall. You don't know that. You can't even predict that at all with the information that you've got right now.
I can tell you that the best estimates is getting into that range of similar to what we've had or a little bigger. You're in the mid-continent, so there's things that can happen that you go, yeah, that wasn't good. So what you're looking for is when you have a big earthquake, what you have is a big fault move. And so they put them as dots, but bigger earthquakes are moving like 10 miles worth of a fault. 50 miles worth of a fault is moving at one time. So if you've got little short faults, you can't make a big giant earthquake. But if you can find nice big several 100-mile long faults like the San Andreas, you go, wow, you could do some fun stuff there. And so that's what you look for, and that's if you want a hazard map and get more detailed scientifically, you look at what's around here and how much fault area can I get to move at once.
Is there any measurable difference between earthquakes that are man-made versus natural occurring?
Yes and no. They've looked for parts of the pattern to use to separate them out. In a lot of ways, they look pretty similar. You're still moving a fault, and the energy that's being released, your well is not generating the energy. Your well just lubricates and gets it to move. And I use an air hockey analogy. You turn on the air hockey air, and the puck starts moving around. The air isn't the main mover. It's just helping reduce the friction. So our injection wells aren't adding the energy that are generating the big earthquakes. It's just releasing energy that's there. So they look pretty similar to Earth ones. In terms of properties, they tend to be a lot shallower, and then they tend to be hanging out near injection wells. But the near is an issue because is that 1 mile? Is that 10 miles? Is that 20 miles? And how far away does that influence go? And so at some point in the courts, there's going to be a big, giant debate over a distance. As far as if I'm Acme Oil, is my well close enough to cause that earthquake? And I'm 13.6 miles, and I know scientifically it's 10. And the other side's going to say, I know it's 20.
If I can sum it up, then the high-pressure injection is forcing more water in that's going to places that otherwise the water will not normally go to because of the pressure. And because it's traveling to these other places, it's going to where it can, which would be the fault line, the micro faults. Eventually, it penetrates an area, serves as a lubricant, and then it causes that energy to be released.
No. So, not necessarily high pressure. All you have to do is get a change in pressure. So you don't necessarily have to be high pressure. You don't have to have the water get there. You need the pressure wave to get there. And so if I had a pipe running here, and I turn on the hose, let's just lay a hose out and turn on the hose, and it's already full, water will kick out the other end because the pressure wave got there, but the water that just came out of that valve didn't make it through. So you don't have to get the water there, you just have to get the pressure there. And then at depth, all the area that we're injecting in is full of water already. And so you're not getting things wet for the first time, you're just changing the pressure on a spot to where it can move.
You said that there's like maybe 4 to 10 wells that are causing all this?
Right.
And so to take a broad stroke and cut everything by 40% seems like it may reduce the problem, but it may not solve the problem until you find those. So the $1 million question is, how do you find those 4 to 10 wells?
So you actually have to collect some data in the wells. You have to.
Each individual one?
Well, if you had a really good fault map, that might help. If you had a good pressure map, that might help.
That's where the $50 million research.
But yeah, you'd have to figure out what are the wells that are the best ones to look at first, because high rate is a good spot to go, and go. How high of a rate are you injecting? I've given one of these talks one time, and a guy said, "I've worked in the oil and gas industry. You can't inject that hard." Like, you guys have gotten better than you remember. So that's a good spot to look. But if you're parked right next to a fault, you don't have to be injecting that hard to get it to kick, as far as I understand. So that's where there's people that have methodologies, but you need to have that funded. You need to have the companies participating in that, and go down that road of saying we want to be more sophisticated than drawing a Band-Aid.
You are seeing that the producers are giving you that data and sharing that and looking for an information for the most part.
They have a legal context for their world. And so there's the technical side that I'm on that says, let's get information. And then there's lawyers that go, I don't know. As far as providing information, they've been very useful. So it's not like they don't want to provide any information. They've been bringing people in and saying, here's maps we've got. This is saying things. Go use that. But they've got problems of, I'm Acme, and I think Beta's wells are doing it. And how do you whistle blow that stuff without having liability for doing that? And how do you know it's not that guy going, I think it's us, but let's blame it on him? We don't have that technical, we don't have the NTSB of oil that says, you guys have done something to say we can let the technical stuff be at the front of the decision instead of behind a bunch of lawyers and spokesmen. And I think it hurts the industry.
Is the information on operating records for wells open to the public? The map that you get on the state page shows all injection wells, and you can't tell anything from that. It's too much information. So I want to know which injection wells are active near me, and when are they active? Is that available to the public?
So that was surprising to a lot of people that prior to this problem, your injection well was after 90 days after the end of the month for February's injection, fill out this form on paper and tell us how much you put in the ground that month. Send that to us by the end of March, April, May. send us a piece of paper that said that one number for what you did in February. And then that went as a piece of paper and got put in a pile somewhere. Through 2014, it's now been compiled by OGS. Kyle Murray's got a database of what got injected up through then from, I think he's gotten back to 2009 and up through 2014, I think. But when we gave this at the legislature, the guy who just cut the budget of the OCC and was one of the proponents of cutting their budget was expecting that there's a nice room with big panels somewhere that looks something like NASA, where when the earthquake happens, the wells that are operating at that time light up and tell you their flow rate and operator. And it's like, no, we're going to go back and look at a database and try to then calculate what would be nearby. We'll call the operator and ask them what they're doing and see if they sent in their piece of paper 3 months ago for the rate. And they were going, what do you mean? And it's, no, that's what we're operating at. So there's not a sense of these guys are on at this time and that there's a magical place that's coming in. The reporters that went down to OGS to watch how we're doing seismicity, it was a closet in the basement, and our state seismologist at the time opened the door and showed them there's a computer sitting on a desk in a closet in the basement.
I'm sure I saw that video.
And they're going, that's your ability to deal with a seismic hazard in the state? Well, we used to have 1.6 earthquakes a year. So it's not high tech. There's a high tech industry involved, and they do some very high tech things, but the disposal side was, this should be as cheap as possible because we're not making money on this. So it was as cheap as possible.
It's sort of ironic that slowing down the oil and gas industry is what pays for, would make more money available for them to use to study, you know.
There's a lot of irony in this whole situation. That's why I put up a little thing about, like, who's the devil, who's the good guy. It's just messy.
We've drilled oil in this state a long time. What has changed? Is it strictly the flow rate?
Rate and volume. Both were kicked up. So 2 papers came out in 2015. One said, I think it's the rate. The other one said, I think it's the volume. And they're kind of tied together. So if you've got them both cranking up, it's hard to pull it apart. And the answer's probably, yeah, both.
All right. Let's thank Todd for coming. This has been wonderful.